So in terms of wheat maturity classes, we are now calling them quick mids, and mid slows. So we've changed from short and long in those terminologies. Apologies if I do mix them up, I still revert to the older way, but generally speaking, we're calling things quicker that are generally about 5 days quicker than SEPTA or faster. SEPTA's at sort of the longer end of the quick mid category, if you like. Then we go to there's a couple of mids, but to be honest, we really treat them as a quick mid as far as the application on farm. And then we get into this mid-slow category, which are generally 5 days longer than SEPTA, but they range quite a bit site to site and season to season. But one of the problems is, like I say, on farm, if we stick to these rules, that we know the old graph of optimum flowering periods and things like that, and there's this key period you've got to hit, and we certainly see that in the data. The problem is how you actually manage hitting them. We can see across our and we say sowing time, but really we're talking germination times in this data. But if you see across that, a lot of your data falls out of this optimum. And on top of that, while we do get these periods where things are pretty good, you can see the trade-offs might change. I'll go through some other sites, but going earlier than optimum doesn't actually look that bad in that data for yield. And if we look later, we can see a more consistent sort of terminal drought declining that yield. But that shifts so much. When we talk about the phenology drivers, I guess, that's also where there's a lot of, I feel like there's a very simplistic approach to it, but when you pull apart the actual science of it, there's still quite a lot unknown about wheat phenology, which is really quite amazing in terms of those main drivers, temperature, ventilation, or cold accumulation and photo period. There's still a lot of unknowns about the actual physiology of those genes and how they react with all the other genes. So if we look at temperature, for example, it doesn't continue to be linear, so meaning that the plant doesn't just keep speeding up as it gets warmer. It gets to a point where it can reach an optimum and then decline actually quite steeply. Now, unfortunately, a lot of studies find a different optimum. They also find a different base temperature for accumulation temperature as well, so it gets pretty frustrating to work with on that sort of approach. And there's all sorts of other aspects where you just think, well, within the day, we are probably going, super optimal sometimes, and we're there sub below. So, currently a lot of our models just work off thermal time, so it's an average between the maximum and minimum daily temperature, and that actually seems to work pretty well. And if it works, I reckon don't stuff around with it, we'll just leave it and move on. And as well as flower power tends to use a location function with observed data, which again, I'm rather happy about because it works, and we don't need to worry about all the things that we don't know. If we look at ventilation, the main thing it does is really extends the vegetative phase and delays that reproductive development of yield components and other things. And so by delaying that, the good thing is it negates, when we talk in early sowing and you have a decent ventilation requirement, it's very good at negating that early higher temperature, which is going to push the wheat along. It's very good at negating that and get a very stable phenology. Photo period, on the other hand, delays the stem elongation phase much more and delays your flowering time. And so even when you often think some of the photoperiod wheats are rushing up in the early sowing, often they still drag out quite a bit to flower, more than the quick mids, if you like SEPTA. But one of the things is as we push it earlier, it does generally get less stable and not as it speeds up if we go earlier and earlier, unlike those ventilation types. We want to talk about the genes, so the main thing is, I think, if you've got 3 winter alleles, that's where you get a very predictable type. But for all the rest of the commercial wheats, to be honest, you're really getting a bit of a mishmash of all the different genes, and I wouldn't say it strongly categorises any of the types personally. And just to make that point, if we look at something that's really, compared to SEPTA, Denison is really quite a longer maturity wheat in the marketplace right now. They've got the same markers for all the major phenology alleles. So it's not really a good basis to dissect any of them. And again, it makes me happier that the department went the path of a statistical model, just looking purely at observed behaviour of wheats and making predictions based on that. It's been working quite well. And one of the other challenges with these rules is that year to year, you might have a 3-week optimum flowering period, but you're getting a 3-week variation in your flowering time for the same location between each season, right? So the idea of setting up a target that you're often not able to hit anyway is always a bad start to your day. But it's just, we need to ensure that we actually understand what the trade-offs are and what's going to happen when we miss, which inevitably we do. And so flower power is really quite good for the relative differences at a location. It's not for making predictions in that season, because the season's going to throw up so much uncertainty in when it's actually going to happen, and then what your optimum is going to be driven as well. But it's very good at showing you relative differences in various scenarios. Obviously, it's also able to make some predictions for major wheat, barley and oats. The challenge we have, though, is, again, these optimum flowering windows work great within any season's data set. The problem is they shift year to year with the same location. So if we just look at 2017 versus 2021, I think Brendan might have mentioned 2021 versus 2022, where a shift in rainfall has just completely shifted that optimum. You know, it's what we see time and time again in a lot of these places. And you know, this isn't frost, this is just purely a rainfall distribution, allowing more biomass to accumulate in the stuff that was later. You're growing a determinate crop in a fast-growing area, and maximising biomass is really going to be about having that indeterminism as you get more and more rainfall, which really is quite hard to achieve with most wheats. At the same time, you can have quite significant yield losses by leaving it too late. So we've seen a lot of farmers, you know, try and cut down this area, and for good reason. It's the consistent loss. The problem is the trade-off in some of these other years can be quite significant. So, you know, people often will say, you know, the north, they need short season wheats up there. It's a quick environment anyway, right? But the reality is that also has the wildest swing in optimum maturity in the state. You know, you can see back in 2017, we're down here for Vixen versus up here where we had a benefit. The longs were better in 2017. I expect 2022 to be pretty similar. So it has the wildest swings in phenology optimums, if you like, year to year. And that's part of just the nature of having an environment that's quick with a determinate crop. And across all the locations across the state, one of the things I really hate about talking phenology is just the variation across the state and soils and seasons. But as you can see, there's no real convergence on that. And different stresses, be it, you know, it's all about terminal drought, Meriden 2020, 2021, we get a frost, severe frost right in the optimum, and it just takes out all good management. So there's a lot of things, again, where some of the old things that people would say was you want to flower after the last frost and before the first heat event. I mean, that's the most ridiculous goal you could ever set. I mean, some of our most economically damaging frosts are even later than when you want to flower. And some of the early heat can come in and it'd be quite disproportionately damaging to your crop as well. So rather than that, what we do see in our data is across a lot of these data sets, we see dry matter is still relating to the best yield, and the grain numbers are reflecting that as well. When you get frosted, obviously those relationships are going to fall apart. If we get a lot of crown rot or other issues, those will fall apart as well. But generally speaking, setting up the crop for a potential in that window is still where it's at. So knowing that we're probably not going to hit the window in a reasonable proportion of our program, we probably need to think more about what those trade-offs are and what ones where we're willing to break the rules a bit more and where we're not. So, you know, this optimum, you know, tends to be, as I say, previously people that talk about frost versus heat, but the dry matter tends to relate more. And so a lot of that is those early opportunities, those early sowing opportunities, getting a longer season wheat into that's not going to hit the terminal drought period, is still going to tend to chase more biomass and chase a higher potential. So it's really focusing on that opportunity while we do that, rather than just a fear of frost that's chasing that potential. Seasonality, obviously, that's going to be a huge factor, and it's very hard to hit it. So therefore, we also want to make sure that we just don't have a big trade-off by getting the maturity choices too wrong, rather than making it perfect. This year, I expect a bit of retillering, like I've seen it in a lot of places, particularly where there was stress early in the season. A lot of the Ag Zone 4, if you like. You know, the crops really ran away with a bit of stress back in early July, and they've just been retillering ever since. I think they're probably still going to yield okay, not great, but okay, and it will cover some of that. But I think we've got some significant quality risks out of plants doing that as well. We've got, you know, heads that have been sitting there for quite a while full of grain versus ones that took a lot longer to become harvest ripe. So as I say, when we're talking across the whole state of West Australia, it's a pretty big region. We've got more than a 40-day gradient in phenology on the same day, same variety. So it's very hard to come up with if I was to try and extend flowering day targets, it'd be a headache for everyone. But luckily, when we sit down and go through all the time of sowing data with the wheat agronomy team, Jeremy and Brenda as well, you know, all the ag zones suggested sowing times actually came out pretty much identical. And what it comes down to is the risk profiles of your site and your season, planning around what an earlier than ideal flowering time is likely to present as risk and what a later is likely to present, given the bucket size and all those other factors. And then making a bit more astute choices about your varieties, particularly in early sowing where I think often you got the most upside out of diversifying. You know, focusing on those factors that knowing I'm probably, even if I sow it in the 4th week of April, it's probably and 3rd week of April, or if I push into an even earlier time to chase a bit of a different opportunity, you've got to start paying a lot more attention in that situation to sprouting and to black point and to these other issues, because those quality risks become exceptionally higher. Jeremy's work's been pretty clear in showing that a lot of your pre-harvest sprouting risk is determined in your seeding choices, and when we push any of these mid to slow wheats early to chase that potential, they will flower earlier than the optimum, and they're still going to chase yield potential, but now we need to make sure we're paying better attention to those things to keep a saleable product at the end of it. Generally speaking, with terminal drought, I mean, the reality is you know, your season rainfall time is going to drive a lot of that, but there will be bucket size implications of that. There will be other factors. You know, we know we've got some paddocks out there that will be having a harsh finish in a lot of years, and there's other paddocks that are going to be much more cushy. So when it comes to diversifying that flowering time, I think there's ways there that we always also can strategise on the way that we push those risks to our favour, rather than just saying, oh, we'll just have a blanket approach, start at one corner of the farm, go to the other. I think we have the option to, if we're going to have a bit of a flowering time portfolio, if you like, target those soil types that are less drought susceptible, if you like, to try and extend the flowering there. If we want to manage frost, obviously we need to manage those paddocks we know are going to be the highest risk. And again, that's not just wheat, because wheat isn't the best way to manage that. But it is more, there's more tools, I guess, in tailoring those options than just having a blanket, here's when you want to sow that variety. So again, if we look at a data set from Katanning as an option, you know, here we have, you know, a significant increase out of going, now these are early, that's mid-April sowing time, so that's earlier than most people would ever want to put in sceptre, but you can see just we start getting into the biomass. Even when we've sown those mid-longs or mid-slows way too early, they're still able to accrue a fair bit of biomass and chase that potential. It's extremely high risk in that environment with frost, right? So I'm not recommending that at all, but I'm saying just the pattern is that this tends to be a typical situation in our time of sowing data, that once we've gone into something a bit longer, even when it's earlier than optimum, it's got the biomass there to chase potential. Then it comes down to that issue of frost and all that. But in this window, for all the early flowering material, whether it's got the biomass or not, you know, that risk of low falling numbers is going to be pretty significant for anything without a good resistance. So if we pull apart those risks, we can probably come up with better ideas. Obviously, like I say, just going into something longer, we're going to get an advantage in biomass. But with frost as well, you know, those other crops are going to be a much bigger lever than just wheat and manipulating that flowering time. You know, if we're going to, again, diversify and worry about different abiotic stresses and how it's going to affect a program given the uncertainty of the year, you know, reaching for something early like an oat or whatever for, you know, with a higher frost tolerance in that earlier than optimum flowering time, we're probably going to be getting a much better gain than mucking around with wheat. With the late stuff, I mean, generally speaking, all those declines, the harvest indexes can still be quite high. It's just reduced dry matter or biomass in almost all that data. And obviously, you're going to have increased risks of crown rot expression and things like that. So it will matter about what variety choices are for certain things like that, as well as, you know, if new products come in and protecting for that, that's going to be a good option. Oh. I thought I'd just better put this up. This is actually a map I've got from Kevin Young sent me a copy, but it's from 1923. And here we have recommendations across the state then, starting from the 1st of April. So keep in mind, back then was a long fallow farming system. This was before lay pastures became vogue. And so they used to sow whenever they could early. And what you also see, though, is that when we talk about the early zone, which is the low rainfall, you can see you've got a bit of a gap in this longer maturity. Then we get to Nabwa and was replaced by Ben Cubbon later, but that's like your mid-slow. It's a bit slower than the current mid-slows in that category for that at the front end of April. But, you know, these wheats were pushing early. You know, they're going from April 1st to May 14th in that area. But what I do see in our work with winters and other things in time sowing data is that, we do see that these areas with reliable Septembers and all that, they are much more favourable to those winter weeds. On the contrast, out in the low rainfall, the winters can be too late. Generally speaking, even in most of our sites, their flowering time will be beyond the optimum, but they can still yield really well in environments that get that good finish. Where you don't have a great chance of a good finish, they can crash and burn. So even back then, they were pretty worked out. 100 years ago, next year, they'd worked all these things out pretty good. And again, observation counts, and it's a good way to operate. But it does give some good implications for how we manage winters. I think they're still a novel concept for most in WA. In most of our time of sowing data, mid-longs, keeping in mind a lot of our sowing dates come back to about the 7th, 9th April is probably the earliest. And in that window, the mid-slows have generally outperformed the winters in WA. As I said, where you get areas where you don't get a favourable even parts of August and September, they can really miss out on their ability to accrue biomass and have any kind of yield potential. And so that is one of the problems that extended vegetative phase has in a lot of parts of WA, is just that it can miss the boat. So I think you've got to put them where basically terminal drought risk is much, much lower. And that can still be in the eastern wheat belt. It's just going to be that which paddocks can really finish well, and there's people that have pushed that and made it work. You've got to also make sure germination's going to happen too, given that if they do come up 3 weeks later, they're just well and truly out of a chance. But where the systems make good sense, I'm tempted to throw to Foz if anyone can hear him, but you had a client at 2J last year, or should I just list the scenario? List the scenario, okay. So you had a lot of rain before the season in 2J last year, and one of Foz's clients basically saw paddocks that he wouldn't be able to have as trafficable if he just had a normal season. And so he made some decisions on a couple of paddocks to try Illabo in discussion with Foz, and sowed that very early, and it really paid off, and he turned out to be spot on. It got wetter and wetter. There is no way in hell he would have been able to get back in that paddock for most of the season, so he was able to take that. So while I think winters have risks, they also have opportunities, and I think the good system logic will drive where they fit in the future. And the other challenge is putting things into March and early April. The reality is you do have some choices to up your sleeve if you're not happy with the outcome by late May, when you probably would have been starting to look at that paddock anyway otherwise. So there's ways there that, a lot of your inputs are all gone in, and you're still going to keep a lot of those rolling into that crop. So where mid-slows also are too risky, such as some really frost-prone areas, I think also winters make a bit of sense there. They do have a bit of risk, but I think there's a bit of opportunity when you know the risks of others are too significant. All good. All right, so I'll move on. So I'll just say, also with these very different maturity types, do we manage their agronomy differently? Not really. The main thing we see is a lot of our agronomy will largely be based around the weaknesses of the varieties, with whatever their maturity is. If you need to manage sprouting or things like that, you're going to be tailoring them to where they're going to be lower risk. If they've got a disease susceptibility, whatever, you're always going to be managing, most of your variety-specific agronomy is going to be about managing the weakness of that variety rather than saying it's this type, I need to treat it that way. When we start talking about early sowing, the plant density targets can come back. We get a lot of data sets where there's no significant difference in early sowing from lower densities. As we get later, to produce that optimum or the higher biomass and higher yield potential, we need to keep those densities up as we go later. But early on, you can get away with quite a lot. So we see the environment really driving a lot of that. Same with nitrogen timing, whether it's a winter or spring, whatever. If you push earlier, a lot of the cut-off times for nitrogen timing still relates to what the environmental conditions are. Herbicides will be an interesting area, I still think, when we start talking about different phase development of winters and things like that, having a longer vegetative phase. Because one of the challenges is when you push those mid-slows early, you could be coming back with first node at the start of June, right? And that limits some options. And so there are potentially other areas where we can improve on that. Quickly mention disease. Jeremy put in some winters down at Esperance last year in March, and a lot of it had a really hard time with disease that we just didn't see in the later sowing times. And so there's other factors there that still come into it. So I'd say phenology is imperfect but important. I feel bad for you guys, you're out of coffee, you've got a phenology talk after lunch. It's about the worst combo I could think of. But, really targeting germination times with maturity types is still giving you an improved yield and reduced risk in a lot of seasons. And it's not always going to be perfect, but, those trade-offs are considerable, and it will you know, there's no way I can say, well, just grow this variety inside in that window. Across that whole state, across all your customers, your clients' areas as well as soil types, you know, there are ways to tailor things to get less of a trade-off in those choices. All right, so I'll leave it at that.